Hi, I'm Reihan Salam,
And I'm Patrick Brennan.
and this is Getting It Right, a National Review podcast. So, Pat, you recently read an article in the New York Times by Kate Zernike that struck you as really interesting. Tell us a bit about it.
So the piece was about Camden, New Jersey's police force, and Camden, New Jersey it's not that large of a city. It's a suburb of Philadelphia, or sort of an exurb of Philadelphia, actually. But it's one of America's most violent, crime-ridden cities. Has huge drug problems. So I'm not just by it, but in the summer of 2012, there were 21 homicides. But the piece begins with noting that in the summer of 2012, there were 21 homicides in Camden. In the summer of 2014, there were just 6. And so it goes through basically what Camden's done to reduce crime so dramatically. And we don't have too many years of data on this, but basically what they did was they sort of demolished the existing city police department and reconstituted under control of the county. And that's what people have talked about a lot. They say sort of returning control, taking it away from the city government and giving it to the county. But the more dramatic things that happened is that they basically fired all the cops, rehired a number of them under totally different work rules, under a different contract, and that
they rehired a number of them, but not all of them, which is very important.
Not all of them, yeah. But the piece goes through a lot of the ways in which sort of things changed, and they were able because, presumably, I mean, it's not entirely clear, but with the same budget, because rehiring people under the newer contracts with different work rules was cheaper, they now have 411 cops versus 250 in the old department. So that's, a 60% increase or something, which is huge, or 40% increase, which is huge. And then it's been combined with a more community-based approach to policing, more cops on the beat, fewer cops like in the station. So response times to 911 calls went from 60 minutes to 4.4 minutes.
Wow. Also, it sounds like in the past, the police wouldn't even respond to a wide range of calls to the police. It's unless there's active violence happening or something like that. It was
and it's interesting because you'd be amazed at what what union work rules can do. I had a guy who's a muni bond analyst actually explain to me that in the city of Detroit that the way that their police system is so broken that cops can't, if you're sitting in the police station, cops by union rules can only respond to one call per hour. So even if they respond, come back after 15 minutes, they're done for the hour.
Wow, that is unbelievable. Well, I think that the point that you raised about the work rules is really interesting, because I think that when people think about the conservative critique of public sector unions, they'll often fixate on this idea that the goal is to trim the workforce. But I think that here is a case where, you got rid of these work rules, and then because you changed them, you're able to hire more police officers, which struck me as a really important insight, because, it could be that, in some cases you actually want to have more personnel doing a particular job, but you don't have that flexibility when you have all these work rules and rigid contracts. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, and with states that or cities that have encountered sort of severe economic stress. So Detroit is one of them. So Detroit's police force has shrunk dramatically. Oakland is sort of famous because as crime was rising dramatically over the past decade or so, they cut the size of the force by 20%. But that was because the city's spending on pensions was rising so dramatically.
Yeah. And Oakland was notorious for the extraordinary expenditure associated with every individual police officer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Nicole Gelinas, who focuses very heavily on New York City, but these issues arise in many American cities, has written a lot about how the pension contributions made by New York City have just ballooned from the early 2000s to now, to the point where New York City is now spending more on pension contributions than it is on the entire police department. So, I mean, had we been spending the same amount we were spending, in 2001, let's say, we could have an entirely new, separate, parallel police force of the exact same size. And that's pretty telling, because it's kind of look, it's not about are you pro-government or anti-government in this case. It's kind of you're crowding out things that actually everyone agrees it's good for government to do, like keep the streets safe.
Right. I mean, this is actually the famous number in New York City is that sort of under Giuliani they got to, I think, the New York Police Department having 40,000 cops, and now it's back down to like 36,000 or something. And I've been at Manhattan student events where they're like, we got to get back to we should have 45,000 cops. And so this is conservatives for more government employees, but it's for government employees who will be able to who are going to be empowered to do the job correctly and be paid in ways that will get them to do their jobs.
One of the ironies here too is that what exactly is the pro-police position? Is the pro-police position that police officers should have these work rules that they've decided on through their unions and kind of imposed on the city, or is the pro-police position, hey, we want to have more police, we want them to be more effective? It's kind of weird because I think in a way conservatives are pretty good at taking on unionized teachers, pretty good at taking on all kinds of unionized public employees. But the police are a funny special case. Like, when Scott Walker was, passing his efforts to revise and limit the collective bargaining rights of workers in Wisconsin, he explicitly exempted police and generally public safety workers. In Ohio, in contrast, Governor John Kasich did not do that with his broadly similar legislation. And in Ohio, that legislation got rolled back, which I think is actually kind of telling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is an understandable justification for it, in part because when people think about the abuses of collective bargaining, it tends to involve very low retirement ages, excessively generous healthcare benefits, and so in some cases that does, and just people, there sort of seems like it's public safety workers, although in public safety workers in New York City involve sanitation workers who, granted do develop lots of like chronic pain problems, but aren't exactly putting their lives on the line. But so people are sort of willing to say like, oh look, I don't want to take spending away from these people who are keeping us safe, and they maybe perhaps should be able to retire relatively early, although a lot of things that cops can do later in life.
But I think that another piece of it, though, is it kind of is similar to the situation with teachers, in which, what you saw in Kate Zernike's article, you found that, okay, so, I guess what some of us would think of as sad news is that this new police force is actually now unionized. The article doesn't go too deeply into kind of how that process went down and kind of what the new union is like, but, the leader of the new union is like, look, yeah, no, we like the new regime, like, we like the new rules, because, why wouldn't we? I mean, we're a more effective police force, and it's also partly the police are more liked in the community, and I think that that's actually kind of important, because it's like, look, if you're doing this job, you're doing it for a reason, and I think that in some cases, having work rules that allow you to do that job effectively, I think it's just a time thing. Like when something gets entrenched, and let's say they're old-timers, there are people who've kind of created these work rules, you get accustomed to them, then you gotta get set in your ways. Whereas here, what they did is really unique. Like, okay, we're just gonna abolish this old police force, start from scratch, and when you start from scratch, there are a lot of things maybe you do differently. But I kind of feel like, there are many police officers, I imagine, who kind of in the absence of this status quo, might actually welcome things that allow them to do their jobs more effectively, and also that perhaps lead them to be more embraced by their communities.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's police unions tend to sort of go back and forth on this issue. I mean, for instance, they opposed both Bloomberg's sort of ratcheting up of stop and frisk because it involved sort of more accountability, but they also opposed the introduction of a federal monitor, which because so they sort of generally tend to be anti-oversight. Period.
which I think that all employees are anti-oversight.
Yeah, right. Which is not something that is confined to
Pat
the
and I are
sector.
Definitely very resistant to oversight.
Yeah. So, but this doesn't come up in the Camden piece, which overall I think we were just drawn to because it's a really heartening example of a lot of sort of conservative principles.
But tell us why you find it so hard. So obviously, okay, one part of it is that, hey, get rid of these crazy work rules, and you're able to actually hire more police, you have more boots on the ground, and that leads to a big drop in crime. But what else did you find heartening about it?
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, so the sort of boots on the ground thing, which is perhaps not quite the right term for it, but is really encouraging because it's actually something. So what do you hear from the left a lot about how to fix policing? I mean, generally they sort of talk about trying to root out, racial biases and disparate treatment. But one of the ways that they suggest to do that is through community policing. So having cops get to know their neighborhoods better. And one way that they suggest doing that is by making the police force look more like the community it serves, as in just have sort of racial minorities make up a closer percentage of the city, have them make up the police force. And Camden didn't actually succeed in doing that for whatever reason. according to the article, it's the police force has the same racial makeup as the old police force did, and we're reading a liberal critic of it, who, and I guess the NAACP complains it's actually much less diverse. But it turns out that wasn't really necessary to make cops get along with their communities. What you needed was to have more cops and better rules, so that cops will just be out there in their communities, walking around, and that's what's really important. So, there doesn't need to be this kind of bean counting.
Which, by the way, also takes more bodies. I mean, to kind of a point
Right.
that you raised earlier, like, if you're going to do community policing as opposed to I'm in a squad car and I respond to emergencies, that latter strategy is, in a way, a lot more manpower effective. I mean, you're using kind of fewer people to do that, but on the other hand, it could sow distrust when the police only show up, kind of when there's like a really egregious, kind of extreme kind of disaster, as opposed to their presence in the community, et cetera. So, I agree with you. I mean, there are a lot of like little heartwarming moments in the piece, like these police officers, apparently with their, according to the article, with their guns still on their person, playing football with these teenagers, and it was really cool. Just the idea that forming those relationships, and actually where your only interaction with these teenagers is not where you're putting them up against a wall, arresting them or whatever else, but it's like, hey, you're actually interacting with them in this way that also, I'll bet, cultivates a kind of respect, because particularly if you're a teenage boy, which I was a very, very, very long time ago. But, to some degree, that both having that kind of respect, but then also feeling like you're like an accessible person. Like, I could imagine being you. Like, you're relatable in some way. And to your point, that's not just about race.
Yeah, and so one barrier to having more diverse police departments that we've been talking about a little bit is it's actually can be difficult just because of the sheer number of African Americans and Latinos who are in the criminal justice system, so who have convictions on their record, and so it to some extent is an intractable problem, at least sort of as it stands right now. That it's just very hard to find minority candidates who want to become cops. Also, there are other reasons behind that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting personnel problem. So Pat and I have found a few different estimates that are frankly a little bit dated, like from the mid 2000s and early 2000s. But you see, the share of African American men aged 20 to 29 who are under the supervision of the criminal justice system. That means in prison, on parole, on probation. You're looking at like about a quarter. I mean, you're looking at a really, really high number, and that's like actively at any given time. So people who are ex-offenders, et cetera. I mean, that's an even bigger number still. So presumably that's going to shrink the share of people who can do that. And then, of course, if I'm a police department, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but you have some educational requirement. You definitely want guys with a high school diploma. Some jurisdictions want someone with a college degree. That's really going to shrink the number of people who can do a job that's, at least when you get started out, not very remunerative. Like, kind of one of the issues is like, look, we want guys who have some, pretty good human capital. They have skills. We also want people who are rooted in the community. I mean, you're eventually getting to a pretty small number of guys who have a lot of other opportunities, and I think that is a barrier that people they kind of assume away. They don't really address that.
Yeah, and it's also this comes up as we've discussed a little with teachers, with public school teachers. So if you are, the teachers' forces in Chicago or New York City tend not to look like the communities they serve either. But that's again because if when you look at sort of racial minority, the women who and men who get college degrees, often have better opportunities and more appealing opportunities. First, there aren't a ton of them, and then once they do have a college degree, they've got a lot more exciting opportunities in becoming public school teachers, generally speaking. So
yeah. I mean, you definitely have to have a kind of mission orientation to do it, or you have risk aversion, and I mean that's a huge problem too, because like when public sector professions are attracting people who are particularly risk averse, it's hardly surprising that they're going to want really rigid work rules, and that they're going to fight tooth and nail against any reforms that are designed to kind of, let's say, make the agency more effective. So one thing I'm wondering about is, okay, so Camden is partly in the news, and, Kate Zernike was explicit about this, because Camden seems to represent an alternative to what we've seen in other American cities and towns, the most prominent of which recently has been Ferguson, Missouri. And, kind of this is something that's been seared in the national imagination. People have, talked a tremendous amount about why was there so much tension in this suburban town between the local heavily black population and the local heavily white police. But I feel like, Pat, you've made some good points about how actually we kind of haven't been talking about the right thing when we're looking at Ferguson and also what it says about the larger landscape of like police-community relations.
Yeah, so one answer that I didn't find very satisfying was that right off the bat, that it's like, why are there these clashes, and why is this such a fraught issue? And like the explanation as well is because the cops are like sitting in MRAPs and have sniper rifles and are wearing helmets and body armor, and that was sort of it was dramatic, and the visuals were so dramatic that I think people were drawn to it. And it was an exciting cause for sort of libertarians and for some conservatives to say, look, the militarization of police. It does seem like a great big waste, but I find that a fairly unconvincing explanation for like why were there these clashes? Why were people so passionate about it? Because first of all, they had to show up to prompt the militarized police people to show up to control the protests anyway. But I mean, so what I think was clear was that the protesters and the cops, they don't trust each other. There was not a good relationship there. It improved as things went on, but it wasn't a good relationship there. And I think that just goes way back before the cops, got their first Humvees in Missouri. So. And that has to do with the basically what are people's interactions with the police department. And there's this sense, and so I think a topic that people move on to, which is I think a good and sort of a better approach to looking at it, is looking at how cops deal with these communities. And the topic is sort of broadly we call it the criminalization of poverty. So where people feel like cops are going after them for small violations for things, and then they end up getting in very financially costly encounters with the criminal justice system, and that's one of the problems.
I have mixed feelings about the militarization critique. So Chris Caldwell of the Weekly Standard wrote a great article in which he kind of, in just a brief aside, kind of cynically suggested that the reason why libertarians were talking about the militarization of the police is that they were so happy to be on the right side of an issue. I mean, and also like a lot of conservatives just didn't want to take their natural position, which is to defend the police and just kind of, or at the very least, just give the police a benefit of the doubt in this situation. I thought that was actually kind of smart. Certainly when you're looking at the kind of conservative intelligentsia as opposed to your kind of run-of-the-mill grassroots conservatives, I think that, kind of with rank-and-file guys, I think there was this reaction of like, well, wait a second, we've got to be on the side of public order. Maybe something happened here, et cetera. Whereas I think it is true that this militarization critique kind of fit that niche. I will say that Radley Balco, who's been someone who's written a tremendous amount about the militarization issue, but also about the criminalization of poverty that you describe, I think that, he has raised some pretty interesting issues about drug arrests in particular, and about the structure of police forces, and frankly, about which functions they're able to raise money for. Just as with any organization, like, drug arrests in particular are a place where there are a lot of resources sent, and it does seem as though you have cases of overkill. But it is right that you need to kind of think subtly. You need to separate, the actual issues, because it wasn't militarization, to your point, that actually kind of caused that tension.
Yeah, I agree. It certainly does seem like a great big waste. So even if it is this free stuff from the Pentagon, I mean, someone has to maintain the stuff, someone has to get trained to use it, and that all does seem relatively pointless. But I mean, to sort of I think that maybe conservatives didn't even sort of give the police quite enough credit, that leaving aside the larger issues and the way that the police deals with the community in general, I mean, it wasn't a very convincing argument that militarized police are very dangerous, given, what we saw actually happen. Very few protesters were hurt. I mean, there weren't even that many arrests. So the protests didn't get all that violent. So I realize that's kind of like sort of a slate pitchy take, but I mean, the handling of the protests, it wasn't awesome, but I mean, rarely do these things get handled very well.
Yeah,
so.
but I think that in itself is a kind of, I mean, I think that the former Seattle police chief who presided over the Seattle police during the so-called Battle of Seattle during the WT meetings of 1999, he's since then kind of repudiated his tactics from back then, and he's kind of talked a lot about how, in a way, we actually might have exacerbated and kind of just kind of that tension in various ways. I can't speak to whether or not that was indeed the case in Ferguson, but I think that you do have ways in which I think these things might kind of escalate conflict. But bracketing all that, I do buy this idea that, look, the fact that in Ferguson there were a lot of people whose relationship with the police was one in which, let's say, they were constantly subject to what they thought of as kind of petty fines and kind of petty harassment. It just didn't engender a lot of distrust. And to me, that's a much bigger and kind of interesting issue that I think conservatives, have thought deeply about for a long time, just about localism and kind of local government and the idea of being rooted in a neighborhood, rooted in a community, and having some sense of ownership and kind of democratic authority over a community. The idea that, the police are public servants. The idea that everyone who's working in government, as opposed to someone who's preying on you. And I think that the thing is, Balco has written this wonderful article for the Washington Post about fines and just about, just the kind of, poor people who are subject to these fines can't pay them off and then just find themselves having to be in jail for short periods of time, etc. It's really amazing. And it's kind of like, in a way, it's like it speaks to some larger thing about American life. People who are not really rooted in their neighborhoods, kind of they're moving back and forth. Their families aren't necessarily very stable, and feeling government as a kind of alien force. I mean, does that make any sense to you, Mike?
Yeah, and it's obviously not just a feeling. I mean, it's just a real obstacle for a lot of people. So one issue that comes up with a lot with these sort of petty violations tends to be cars, and so having expired driver's license, expired registration. And all those things matter, but I mean, how onerous does the fine need to be to for an expired driver's license or expired vehicle registration or a broken taillight? Conservatives tend to think that policing these small things prevents sort of a larger atmosphere of criminality from prevailing, and I think that there's a lot of support for that, but this becomes a huge problem. So if you lose your driver's license because because of some other petty violation, now it's going to be illegal for you to drive to work. I mean, so it creates real barriers to economic and social mobility.
Yeah, you legitimately can't function in a lot of the country without a car. So it's really just it's a huge body blow.
Yeah, which is probably a problem all its own, that we haven't sort of built a place like Ferguson, Missouri is very poorly structured for social mobility. A place like New York City actually isn't so bad because at least public transportation does tend to be a great thing for people lower down the.
This is one of my personal obsessions. So in some of these towns in St. Louis County, you're talking about upwards of 40% of revenue is generated by these municipal courts that are assessing fees, kind of that are, imposing, interest on fines left unpaid and what have you. I mean, it's extraordinary. Because when you think about a healthy town, you've got property values that are reasonably healthy, and so property taxes don't have to be that burdensome because the property values are high. So that's how this. Or let's say you've got enough sales tax.
To the residents of Westchester County, their valuable houses mean tax rates don't need to be that high.
But or sales tax revenue. Let's say when you have towns that work. Kind of that have, let's say, a lively commercial or whatever, you can raise revenue in that kind of a town. Whereas a lot of these towns, they're single-family home neighborhoods that were built quite a while ago. They experience white flight. They're now not full of, two-parent families. They're full of a different kind of family that frankly can't maintain these houses a lot of the time. So you got this kind of supercharged, accelerated decay. And I think that your point is a really good one because in a way, okay, well, if the revenue problem is why the police are oftentimes being so aggressive, the revenue problem flows in the fact that actually these towns just are not traditional towns that have that kind of balance, that have just enough density where you can know your neighbors and actually kind of have jobs relatively close by. It's just kind of weird. It seems like such a deep set of problems that saying that it's oh, we'll just have community policing, or oh, we'll just hire more black police officers. It's kind of we've got cities with heavily minority police forces, and you've got the same exact tension there than you do here. I mean, tell me, you've read a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. I mean, you're pointing to a root sort of structural geographic cause for why some of these places are economically depressed, and I think that's one of the problems. But I mean, so at least when we think about that, one of the things driving the criminalization of poverty and these the overfining and everything, right, is just the fact that these towns don't have very substantial tax bases, and so it's not it doesn't have to be because the city government enjoys soaking the poor for these things. It's because if you're a city government, you have to balance the budget, and probably these, in some ways, I'm sure some of the governments basically are just sort of oversized for the for the population and the economic and the tax base that they now have. There's no easy way to fix that, of course. But so there doesn't need to be this sort of malicious approach to it. But it's just like, they have to find a way to bring in revenue, and people, nobody likes whatever sort of one's economic status, no one likes raising taxes. So I think there's always sort of more political support, even if it's, you see in Ferguson that it seems like a lot of the political power is held by white residents, but I mean, so they'd be voting to sort of raise tax, indirectly raise tax on the poor, but in general, people don't like to raise tax rates.
It goes back to your point about union work rules in general, because if you look at a city like Detroit, at its peak, it had a population of 2 million. Now, I believe it's, hovering around 800,000, maybe even a little bit less than that. And yet, you had a public sector that grew at a time when the city had a much bigger population. And, fundamentally, these rigid work rules create breaks that don't allow you to engage in that kind of reallocation and kind of to right-size the government so that it actually fits the needs of the population. I think that's a really important point. But in general, I'm curious. So there's been a pretty steep decline in violent crime over the last 20 years across much of the country. But I kind of feel like Ferguson has brought crime and policing back to the national consciousness, at least for, the kind of people who follow national news. Do you think that's fair to say? I mean, is that...
Yeah, although it does seem like the news cycle can be sort of proceeds at a dizzying pace now. So we're even it's been sort of
already
2 weeks since people were sort of obsessed with. But yeah, I mean, and there was a BuzzFeed piece, I forget by whom, but a BuzzFeed politics piece saying that this was sort of the moment when the conservative police reformers have arrived. And there are a variety of groups that have been working on conservative criminal justice reform for a long time. But there's a group Right on Crime, the which may be associated with the Texas
Public Policy Foundation,
associated with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and so they've been doing good work, and so I think that this finally was the impetus for some change. I mean, one thing that's also sort of there's a temptation, and Senator Rand Paul, who's big on these issues, I think fell prey to this a bit when he introduced a sentencing reform bill along with Democrat Cory Booker. To sort of federalize these issues and to think about, okay, how can we get the federal government to push people, push states and towns to fix their policies? And I don't think that's the right approach on just about any issue. It certainly has gone very poorly for conservatives on the education front. So you got to let these communities sort of make the case to local governments and hope they...
The thing that makes me nervous is this. I think that there are a lot of legitimate conservative critiques, like, for example, of over-criminalization. I think that's a huge issue. I mean, there are a lot of things that are illegal that shouldn't necessarily be illegal. And I think that that's something that relates to a kind of small government critique. But the one thing is that, I just don't want conservative advocates of criminal justice reform to get to a point where they're saying, oh, well, we shouldn't be punitive or kind of whatever. Like, the thing is, okay, I will accept that actually the system as it exists is actually way too punitive in certain ways. But I think the deeper issue is, I think that our criminal justice system just isn't fitting our society very well. It's not so much that it's too punitive or whatever else. It's more that it just doesn't feel democratic. When you think about the colonial era, you had juries that consisted of people drawn from these communities, and they were applying their community standards, and people did not feel as though the criminal justice system was an alien imposition on them. Now, granted, look, it's a big, diverse, urbanized, complex society. The sheer scale of what law enforcement agencies have to do is such that mechanization is to some degree inevitable. But I really believe that I want there to be more of a sense that justice is being done, and that could mean giving victims a bigger voice. That could mean, and that doesn't just mean like let's make things more punitive. It means let's demand contrition and forgiveness from people. Let's see to it that people who are being punished, that they actually are knitted back into the community by expressing contrition. I know this sounds like very weird and abstract, but I guess
puritanical.
And puritanical, but I guess, but that's where I come from. I mean, I just kind of really believe that what I believe is at risk is that many of our communities are not really communities anymore. Ferguson went from being, I think it was something like 3/4 white to being 2/3 black in the space of like a 20-year period. And a lot of those guys were new arrivals. They do not feel deeply embedded in that community. And I think that, Ferguson might be an extreme case, but I think that there are a lot of American communities like that where, people, their home is not their home. It's, kind of a place you happen to live right at this moment. That's where you kind of, collect your paycheck or whatever else. And I think, and maybe that's modernity, that's inevitable, but I think that actually poisons a lot of things, including our criminal justice system.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem, and it's on that sort of semi-depressing note, perhaps we will wrap it up for this week. And so our podcast is published and promoted on Mondays, and soon, I am told, we will be on iTunes once our tech expert, Charles Cook, returns from a vacation in France. We will be on iTunes. But thank you very much for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week.